my background really briefly, because I want to really get into the model and talk about the influences that got into it. As Heather said, I've been in the field of domestic violence for 25 years. Came in through the doorway of doing work with perpetrators. And you'll see the relevance of that as I kind of talk about the model itself. What's important to know about that work with perpetrators is that it's good work with perpetrators is and needs to be grounded in victim safety. And it's really, it's very important, as you see, and I'll talk about the development of the model, is that there needs to be a strong connection with the work we do with men in general and the work we do with domestic violence perpetrators specifically, and really always bringing it back to the relationship it has to the safety and well-being of women and children. And so that's really the context that I come out of. I ran perpetrator groups for a very long time, and then about 17 years ago got involved with working with child welfare, and started in one state in the US, and it's really grown to be a national relationship with lots of different child welfare agencies across the country. And really my goal has been to help child welfare do its mission. And at this point in time, with the data and the information we have, and really the data becomes more and more compelling, that child welfare's caseload is heavily influenced by domestic violence. The numbers that we see across the US and Canada and Australia are just sort of staggering in terms of either cases coming in through the door because of domestic violence, or cases that come in for other reasons that have domestic violence as a significant factor. And I would point people to some of Kathy Humphrey's work here in Australia, where she really kind of articulates that really very well. And so our work has really been to say to child welfare, it's hard to imagine doing your job around child safety, permanency, well-being without certain baseline competencies around domestic violence. And so in this way, the Safe Together model is very much a child-centered model, and the work we've been doing is to support child safety in their mission. And part of our work, and I'm not going to highlight it today, is really looking at what it takes to create domestic violence-informed child welfare systems. And this doesn't mean we're trying to replace the work of the domestic violence sector or men's behavior change work. We're really looking at systems that are focused in their mission on child safety and well-being, and really helping them do their job to the best ability they can do it. Part of the context for this obviously is I believe it's true here in Australia, it's true in the UK, it's true in the United States, that when kids get hurt badly or die, the domestic violence is frequently, almost always, present in the context of those cases. I have a friend, colleague, Dr. Evan Stark, who I'm going to mention a little bit later in terms of his work around coercive control and child protection has been one of the influences on the model. And he worked in New Jersey on the Child Fatality Review Board. And what he said is basically every non-SIDS case, every non-sudden infant death case they worked on had domestic violence in it. And I think we see that data repeated over and over again in different levels in different ways. And that so when you just look at that level of the extreme severe cases that child safety gets involved in, we really see the domestic violence involvement. But we also see it in the substance use cases, the mental health cases, the housing instability cases, that really domestic violence is frequently a factor. We're launching this new project, the International Center for Innovation in Domestic Violence Practice. And I'm not going to kind of linger on it, but the context for our growing work internationally is this organization. We're really trying to push and develop and incubate domestic violence innovations around practice. And a lot of our work, as you'll hear, is about sort of how do we bring this information down to a practice level. And right now we have 4 practice innovations we're focusing on. And this morning's presentation is really going to focus in on the Safe and Together model suite of tools and interventions. But you can see from this that we also do a lot of work on responsible fatherhood, batter's accountability and change, and we also really look at the whole system in terms of domestic violence-informed child welfare systems. So when we talk about the Safe and Together model, and I'm sorry that the folks who missed the workshops yesterday and the day before are get just a small slice of this, we're really talking about a suite of tools and interventions. I'm going to talk about briefly the critical components of the model and the model characteristics. But the model itself gets implemented through a number of different avenues. So we often go into communities and do multiple days of training and technical assistance. A lot of places we go in the US, we'll do up to 17 days of training over a period of time. Our relationship with a lot of jurisdictions are multi-year relationships. State of Florida, Ohio, Oregon, Connecticut, New York. We've been working with them at a state level for a number of years. So for instance, our work in Florida, where I'll cite some of the data, our relationship goes back with both their statewide domestic violence coalition and their child welfare agency at the state level since about 2006. And so we continue to work with systems over a period of time. And the good news is that systems are committing to this work over a long period of time. The bad news around it, to be honest, is how slow change can be. Because we're really looking at a number of different fronts, and you'll get a feel for this, I hope, as we kind of talk about this, that in many ways people will respond to the Safe and Together model and say, this is a paradigm shift for us in terms of our work. And so when you think about the Safe and Together model, really think about it as a set of trainings that we do, practice tools. Yesterday we did, and in Mackay we did, spent a whole lot of time talking about pivoting as a practice tool. And what pivoting really involves is a very structured way to take a conversation that often focuses on the domestic violence victim and her decision making. It basically implies it's the victim's choices that put the child in danger. And to pivot from that focus onto the domestic violence perpetrator's behavior and the interventions with them. And then from that established context, return to the discussion about how do we engage and work and support with the victim. And the pivoting is a very structured, formal way that we've developed over time to work within a child-serving context that really lets people say, okay, we have struggles, like for instance, the victim may be lying because she's trying to keep herself and her kids safe or afraid of child welfare. That isn't what's driving the child safety concerns. If it's the perpetrator's behavior, it's the perpetrator's behavior that's driving the child safety concerns. And so how do you bring that into focus, but also understand there's a legitimate interest to be able to gauge and support and talk to the victim about the situation she's in, that the children are in, and do that in a way that's non-blaming and constructive. And so the model really kind of works through a number of these different aspects. And you can see this visual representation of the model and sort of how it ties together. And then we're really looking at the core of the model, the critical components, the principles. We're tying it together with these practice tools, which are very formal, structured things. Part of what we've developed with the model is a way to to land domestic violence knowledge and expertise in child-serving systems. So really bring it down to the level of if you're an evaluator working with a family, what are you supposed to evaluate and what are you supposed to look at? If you're a child safety officer, what are you supposed to assess for? How do you actually build a bridge to the domestic violence victim that she may or may not step onto, depending on her level of fear, what she's capable of doing, but that it really looks at our practice. And so a lot of what we get really positive feedback on the model, I think what we saw in Mackay and also here in Brisbane, is that folks really appreciated that we really gave language. How do you talk to a domestic violence perpetrator in a way that focuses on their behavior and their responsibility as a parent? How do you really actually establish a partnership with a domestic violence victim? How do you document all this in your case record? And how do you sit in meetings cross sectors and discuss the case in a productive way that feels good to everybody? And so the model really comes down to, through these practice tools, to really improving competencies and cross-systems collaboration with the goal of really increasing outcomes for children and families. Again, to sort of give you a piece of the scope of the model itself, is you've got a list of the current package of practice tools. The other thing we spend a lot of time in training is mapping perpetrators' patterns onto case practice. And you're going to see, as I talk about this, that it's really hard for child welfare and for anybody else who's interested in the safety of kids to do good decision making around domestic violence when what they've got is there's a history of domestic violence, and that's all they know about the case. And so what you see in language and discussions is people say there's a history of domestic violence, so the couple's engaged in domestic violence. And that language actually obscures the perpetrator's responsibility. And beyond that, it doesn't give folks interested in developing case plans, engaging victims, understanding impact on kids, the information they need to actually do their job. And that information starts with a description of the perpetrator's pattern of behavior. And so one of the things we suggest and guide people in, based on the model, is what would change in your practice if instead of writing down the family has a history of domestic violence, that you write down the father in this family has a history of perpetrating domestic violence against multiple partners. So the definition goes beyond just this current situation. It's a perpetrator-based pattern versus a relationship-based pattern. And that behavior with his current partner includes strangulation, assault while she was pregnant, subsequent to the child being born and involved, interfering with the ability to care for the child, cutting the family off from employment and from friends and family, repeated physical assaults in the presence of the child, and interference with mom's ability to seek help for herself and the kids. What if that's what was written down instead of the history of, this family has a history of domestic violence? How would that change conversations? How would that change practice? How would that change our ability to engage the victim and give a context for her decision making? How would it change the way child safety workers felt about engagement in their own safety? Because what we would know in many cases is this person doesn't have any history of being assaulted to other people. So maybe that would make me more comfortable as a child safety officer going out engaging this perpetrator. And so without that information visible about the perpetrator's specific behaviors, because domestic violence at its heart is a behavioral problem. And if you can't describe the actual behaviors, you have really a lot of trouble actually doing the case planning and the casework that you need to do. And you also unfairly may target one person who's labeled a perpetrator who actually is at a truly lower level of violence than another perpetrator who actually is at a much higher, much more severe level of dangerousness to the children of the family. Because really we use these words, domestic violence perpetrators or domestic violence, and perpetrators are a fairly heterogeneous group of folks. They really vary in the level of dangerousness, they vary in the level of parenting capacity, they vary in their level of engagement with the family. So perpetrator mapping, pattern mapping, really is a fundamental practice that really lets you kind of look at what does this information mean for worker safety, understanding impact on kids, contextualizing victims' decision making. It's really difficult to understand victims' choices without understanding perpetrators' patterns. If you don't know that the perpetrator sabotaged her attempts to go to family and get safety, and you don't know that he targets family and friends, then you may say, well, her family lives just down the street or another town over. Why doesn't she just go there? They have resources. But if you don't know that when she has done that, he's actually targeted her elderly mother, and that to be a good daughter, she's come back and moved away, that you would look at her decision making and might just say, well, she just won't leave. But once you put his behavior in practice and in focus, you really begin to understand. It becomes easier to contextualize her decision making and to build a relationship based on her strengths and really see what she's doing. Without his pattern, it's really hard to really engage him, make meaningful plans, hold him accountable for his behavior. And this all kind of flows through to supervision and to case practice. And so when again you sort of see pieces of the model, really understand we really work to bring it down to this level of practice. And part of the history between developing this model is that we've worked side by side with child welfare, with domestic violence advocates in the field to really develop this approach in a way that really helps them do their job. Won't spend a lot of time, but really we want you to see the scope of the work in the US and internationally. It's often tied to differential response, other child welfare initiatives, and just wanted to get you a feel for where we're working and the situations that we're involved in. So one of the core things around the model is it's very simple in one way, but in practice it can be very hard to do, which is when we're looking at domestic violence as a child safety and risk factor, it's the domestic violence perpetrator's behavior, not the victim's decision making, that's creating that child safety and risk factor. And I like saying that, and then you put a full stop at the end of that sentence. There's no commas, there's no parentheses, there's no caveats. And that means even if she's going back to him, even if she's been in multiple relationships where she's been abused, these are often the things people will say, that still means that if the domestic violence is our child safety concern. Now we also may be concerned the mom's driving drunk with the kids in the car. That's a separate concern. Or if she's hitting the kids, that's a separate concern. When we're looking at the domestic violence, we want to really be able to draw a straight line between the perpetrator's choices and the impact on the kids, and practice in a way that really reflects that when we talk to her, she hears from us that we believe he's 100% responsible for his choice to get violent and that she's not responsible for his violence. We want to really make sure that's clear when we talk to him. We want the therapist and other practitioners working with the family to also integrate that into their approach. And that what we find when we do that, we're clearer in our work with him, and actually helps us support him and promote behavior change when it's possible, and it really strengthens the partnership with her. And we really bring that down to very practical levels of case practice and cross-sector coordination. And I felt like I couldn't go much further. I wanted to highlight today this piece, which is really that, and I'm going to talk about it as part of the influence of the work, that when we're looking at this issue, it's really hard to separate it out. In my mind, it's almost impossible. To separate it out from an understanding that the child serving system, the human services system, and really we're talking about the broader culture and communities, and really my experience is this is true across communities and cultures in the US, at least, in the US context, that it's really hard not to see that we have two different standards of parenting for mothers and fathers. And it's really hard to decontextualize this issue of domestic violence, particularly perpetrators who are male, from and the situation where mothers are most of the victims, to really from this gender piece as well. And so I just created this slide to really give people a sense of this double standard, and I'll do the visual aid here because people really like it. It's very high tech. Be prepared for this. So this is really very important. It looks something like this. And this really represents our expectations of mothers. And this represents, you probably figured it out, right? Expectations of fathers. And it really makes it hard for us to hold batters who are fathers accountable for their impact on their kids because we have such high standards for mothers. And so the way this plays out oftentimes is if you ask people who go and work in the field with families, who do you ask if the kids are medically up to date? They're going to say they ask mothers. And you ask them who they talk to about kids counseling and medication, other things, they're going to say we talk to the mother. And when you ask them about who's responsible for keeping the kids clean, all those things, they're going to say, well, it's mom. And really, this is universal. And I check it out wherever I go in the US, as everybody says, and here in Australia, every time I've asked that question, I get the same answer. And what that means is that we have a really hard time linking fathers who are abusive, their violence, to their kids, because really we've limited to, did the kids see it, did they hear it, were they present for the physical abuse? And when we include this with a gender double standard, we really make invisible all the different ways he undercuts her parenting, interferes with the ability to meet the kids' basic needs. And so when you look at these things, and one of the pieces of influence in this, and if you're interested in looking at this sort of literature, George Holden's article on terminology and taxonomy related to kids and domestic violence does a really wonderful job describing. He describes 10, but ultimately 9 different pathways by which kids get harmed by domestic violence perpetrators' behavior. The 10th pathway is not at all, but the 9 different ones. And so what he does is include, immediate effects. I mean, he includes the seeing, includes the hearing, the possibility they're physically injured. But he really kind of builds in this piece around sort of experiencing, the language is great, experiencing the aftermath. And oftentimes, because we have these double standards, all that aftermath problems we lay on the mom, not on the perpetrator. The behavioral issues is she can't control them. The housing issues are she can't keep housing over. So if the violence forces her to move multiple times, and there's housing instability, and we look at the issues related to that, we often go and talk to her about her inability and document as her inability to keep stable housing for the family. And so what we're really trying to do, one of the basic tenets of the model, is to make the perpetrator's role and influence in the family and the impact on the kids visible. And that's separate from our ability to engage him. He may not make himself available, we may not be able to work with him. That should not stop us from talking to her and formulating our understanding of the case through the lens of the perpetrator's responsibility for his impact on the children. And so we really end up in this cycle where we have a gender double standard, we miss things, we don't document, we don't create services, and that reinforces the fact that we don't really see what's going on. And so oftentimes people will say, workers will say, well, why should I engage him or see this? Because we don't have services for him, or I'm not expected to do it. Nobody's told me to go meet with him. I can get through my whole case without ever meeting with him or documenting his behavior. So what I learn is that that's not important. And so there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. The practice principles of the model you can kind of see, and they're very clear. They're about partnering with the domestic violence survivor around the safety and well-being of kids. The idea that keeping kids safe and together with a non-offending parent should be our goal, and really intervening with perpetrators is very important. What I want to say about the name and the connection to the literature and the development of the model, is that the name Safe and Together refers to this idea that, from the kid's point of view, that it's really ideal for us to keep kids safe and together with a non-offending parent. We talk about stability, safety, nurturance, healing from trauma. When you look at this in the context of the literature and the work that's done around kids and exposure to violence, you can see the connection that's there and the importance, because what we have is, through the therapeutic work that's being done, one is that the idea that we know that kids are resilient, and that one of the things that fosters resiliency is a relationship with adult caregiver and provider. And in homes with domestic violence, it's likely to be the victim, not the perpetrator. So we really want to foster, the literature really points us to, one, fostering the relationship between the non-offending parent and the kid for the purposes of healing from the trauma from the perpetrator's behavior. So you also see that most of the major interventions that are designed for kids are not isolated interventions with the kids alone, but things like TFCBT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really focused on both the parent and the child and their stories, and about really bringing them together around that. Or parent-child psychotherapy. These are interventions therapeutically designed to support the relationship oftentimes between that non-offending parent and the child. And so the literature and the therapeutic work really kind of speaks to this idea that we really need to be focusing and supporting the non-offending parent if we're concerned about the children's well-being. If you go to the National Children's Traumatic Stress Network's website, which is a US-based consortium of providers and funded by the federal government in the US, and look at their website, one of the first things they'll say is, if you want to help kids around domestic violence, you need to work to keep the victim safe, their mother safe. So there's a real clarity from folks who are providing work for children and focused on the needs of children, that we need to be focused on their relationship with that non-offending parent, strengthening that, and they also need to be focused on the safety and well-being of that non-offending parent as well. In practice, what we end up seeing is, and this has been one of the influences on the model, is when you actually go in and you talk to victims and you listen to their stories, they're going to describe to you that they're often engaged in parenting in a foxhole, that they're often doing tremendous things to keep their kids safe, stable, on track, in school, well-fed. So if they're kept up all night, and if you're working in the domestic violence sector or child safety, you may be very familiar with these stories, which is, he kept her up in the middle of the night with accusations of affairs, maybe sexually abusing her, maybe physically assaulting her, and she still gets up at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m., gets herself up, gets the kids up, gets them clean, gets them dressed, gets them fed, and gets them off to school. And part of the issue, and going back to my very favorite sort of very high-tech thing, is we don't validate that, we don't write it down, we don't document. Why? Because it's just what we expect mothers to do. And so that piece of parenting in a foxhole, that piece of keeping the kids stable, and often we're challenged because some of these kids are doing really well, and we go, how is that happening? It's because she's doing these things to keep them on track in some of these cases, and the kids therefore are having a somewhat normal life actually in the face of the perpetrator's behavior. And part of what the model really does is encourage people to look beyond, did she call the police, did she end the relationship, or did she get a court order, to all the daily things she's doing to promote the safety and well-being of the children. And so the model really has a very systematic way between those principles, these critical components, to really kind of drive practice and decision-making in a good direction. And so to give you a sense of sort of where the model was, the influence and how it was developed, and I was saying to Heather earlier, it's really hard to reflect on 25 years worth of work and articles read and conversations had and say, in 40 minutes, boil it down to, this is what kind of influenced the work. But I'm going to do my best to talk about some of the influences. I'm going to kind of jump ahead here. Some of the influences and some of the people. Because for me, it's really hard to separate out. It's not just the material read. It's not just the experience we had doing the work, it's the relationships with people that we've had who've been influential over the years. The first thing really is being very committed and very grounded. I've kind of pointed to this in victim-centered work with perpetrators. Work with perpetrators is challenging, it's difficult. Engagement with men is challenging, can be difficult. To make it safe, to make it good, it needs to be feminist in its nature, and it needs to be grounded in its orientation to safety and the betterment of the lives of women and children. So for me, that was a very fundamental starting point, and I remember sort of meeting with Sue Schechter and going to trainings that she delivered in the US before she passed away. It's a long time ago, 1990, years ago. And really getting exposure to her. Jill Davies, who was a leader in the domestic violence field and was involved in our Green Book efforts in the US to look at child maltreatment and child protection systems and domestic violence. And really being taught by them how to stay focused on women's empowerment, women's choices, and really embedding this model and idea that the goal should be safety, self-determination, and satisfaction, greater satisfaction in their lives for women and kids. And so that even though I'm working with perpetrators, and the work, when we talk about working with perpetrators, we're focused still on the outcomes for victims and kids. And people often confuse that when we're trying to implement the model, which is that they think, well, you want to work with a perpetrator, you're going to become an advocate for that person. And really what we're talking about, non-judgmental engagement with them about their behaviors. And that really is helpful when you work with marginalized men who've been disenfranchised, who faced racism, who faced employment issues, other things, because you can meet them in a way where you're not demonizing them and turning them into a monster. But the focus on behaviors gives you a very strong foundation to talk to them. These are about the things we're concerned about. We're not saying you're a bad person even. We want to support you being a good dad, but these are the behaviors you've done that we really want to see changed. And so that behavioral focus gives you a good foundation to both engage the perpetrator, but not lose sight of the ultimate goal, which is that the kids should be safer, the family should be functioning better, the adult survivor should be able to function as a human being and a person and a parent. So that's one influence in development of the model. Another influence is making information about perpetrators relevant for other sectors. You want to look around and think about substance abuse, mental health, child protection, domestic violence services for survivors, court personnel, judges, other people, adult probation, and say, what do they need to know about working with perpetrators for their field? And so you begin to see that, for instance, men's behavior change programs have something to teach adult probation about how to interview perpetrators about their violence that can be applied appropriately in their work. Or substance abuse counselors need to know something about talking to men who are violent in a way that doesn't collude with them around their violence. And so what we did a lot of work in the beginning of the development of the model is really say, what do you need to know about perpetrators to do your job well? And you can see how the model developed then to focus on child safety and say, what do you need to do in your job to do it well? The model was very much influenced by a deep desire to understand, respect, and value different sectors' roles and the importance it plays in the lives of families. So for instance, we have a deep commitment, and again, my alliances with advocates in the US are strong, and the work that is done there is so important. And so we really have a deep respect for the role that confidential advocates play for domestic violence victims. To have somebody you can go and talk to who's not going to share that information with anybody else, who you can work through what you need and discuss things. And so we see the value of that, and we also really value the role that child safety plays in communities where they're the last line of safety for kids. We've asked them to step into these families where there's a lot of dysfunction, where there's violence, where there's harm, and be a backstop for families and to help keep kids safe. And so we approach the conversations between the sectors with great respect and a great appreciation of what they can do and what they're being asked to do. And to understand that oftentimes when there's conflict, it's in my experience, it's rarely around people, but it's mostly about systems. And the conversations that we've been able to foster is oftentimes translating back and forth between child safety and domestic violence advocates. We've been able to be a translator at times using the Safe and Together model. And so, so oftentimes we've been a translator where advocates have said, why doesn't child welfare keep them out of the house? And because of our intimate knowledge of child welfare, we'll say, well, what kind of tools does child welfare, child safety have to do that? And they go, what do you mean? I said, well, they have to have tools to control a person, and often involves court involvement. And then we're educating domestic violence advocates who are angry at child welfare for not intervening for all those things. So that's one way we play a translation role. The model was also developed out of years and years of case conversations with child welfare workers who came to us and said, I need help for services for this mom. And then we would have conversations about, well, what would you hope the service would do? And they say, well, I would hope it would give her insight into the impact domestic violence has on the kids. And then I'd say, well, how are you going to measure if she's been successful in gaining more insight? And the response was almost uniformly at that point. And it's gotten much, much better over the years. The response would be, well, she would leave. And you could see embedded in that expectation that insight equals leaving, and that not leaving equaled lack of insight. You could really see how that dovetails with a failure to protect perspective. Because the assumption is if you're still there, you don't understand, you don't care, you're picking him over the kids. And in that moment, his behavior, his responsibility is being made invisible, and the victim is being made the source of the danger to the kids. Her choices, her poor insight. And I use that in quotes. And so the model really developed out of the conversations and to meet the needs. It didn't stop there. It couldn't stop there, because child safety needs to get to child safety by 6 p.m. I'm using that as kind of just as a metaphor, which is you can't say, folks, don't do that. You have to say, do this instead. And so we really work with them, say, well, what do you do instead of saying she's got to protect? And a shift in that requires focusing on the perpetrator's behavior and developing plans around that. We've really developed the work out of a great understanding of victims' decision-making choices and how they're actively working to keep the kids safe. And that's come out of work with victims themselves and advocates. And pointing to some of the literature around this, there's a great article called Mother Strategies for Protecting Children from Batterers, Perspectives of Battered Women. And it's a small study, it was a focus group study, but it really illustrates what we've seen in practice, which is that victims are engaging in a variety of active things to do to protect kids physically and emotionally. And this study, which was just 17 women who were involved with the CPS caseload, most of them described strategies to actively keep their kids safe in an immediate situation, and then intermediate and long-term strategies around physical safety. And then specific strategies, I'll just say this, specific strategies to support the kids, to provide them hope, limited truth-telling as a strategy. You don't want to tell kids every bit of information. This fits with, well, don't parentify them, all these things that we use in our work. And so when we look at this piece, for us, the part of the model really says identify her full spectrum of efforts to promote the safety and well-being of the children. This is what it's connected to, which is we should walk into these homes assuming she was safety planning and supporting the kids before we ever showed up. And that's the lens we should use. And this is what battered women tell us about what they're doing. And that doesn't mean the kids are safe, but it means you have a partner there. And that part of our job, what we have control over as the state, as providers, NGOs, is we have the ability to go looking for it, to validate, to ask her about it, and to use it as a foundation to strategize and do case planning in partnership with her. That's on us, 100%. Now, she may not step up in different ways. She may be scared to talk about it. But the responsibility for us as professionals is to really see that, know the literature, know the work, and really engage in practice that's based on what we know. Don't go in assuming because she's still there, she doesn't understand the domestic violence. And really use that as a foundation. I also want to point people to the work of Simon LaPierre out of University of Ottawa, who's written some great articles about this as well. So people are looking for sort of the context of this. And then also, we've really been influenced in the same way by Evan Stark's work in New York. He worked on the Nicholson case. And part of what we end up saying in our trainings is sometimes victims aren't broken. And in fact, yesterday we had a case that was presented where it was very clear, this happens over and over again. Child safety officers will say, I am not concerned about her parenting at all. The only reason we're involved with his family or we still have the kids is we're concerned about his violence. And Evan's work in New York on a lawsuit in New York City, what he pointed to is that domestic violence victims on the child welfare caseload often had many less problems, other problems, than other mothers on the caseload. And that what it was pointing to is that women were often coming into the child welfare system simply because they were victims, not because they were bad parents. And that made them very different than women who came in for other reasons. And we see this played out all the time. I was just doing work in New York State where up until recently, if they had 2 incidents of domestic violence in a family, regardless of who the perpetrator was, well, regardless, this way, they would take the victim of the domestic violence and name her as a perpetrator in the ongoing case, simply because there had been ongoing domestic violence, because there had been more than one incident. That's a classic example of women coming into the system solely as perpetrators, solely because they're victims, not because there's any direct concerns about their parenting. So when we have this piece that about the model, we have these influences that really drive it, and the last thing I may get to say something about, I have 5 minutes, I'll have to still say a couple more things then, is the gender analysis. And I feel very passionately, very strongly about this, that the gender analysis is critical to doing good work in this intersection of domestic violence, child maltreatment, and child welfare practice. We really have a clear sense that domestic violence is a gendered issue, and that while both men and women can be violent, and that battering happens in same-sex relationships, and I'll talk a little about the fact-based nature of the model in a moment, that really when we look at injuries, when we look at the context of violence, that men's violence is often more contextualized into coercive control than other behaviors, that men are much more likely to cause injuries to women with their use of violence than vice versa, and we can use injuries as a proxy for fear or control. That really based on that gender nature of the violence, and also based on the fact of this very fancy high-tech sort of double standard example, that we really approach families in a very gendered nature, that we really need to approach this with an awareness that that this is not, we can't use language that obscures gender. Many of our systems will use the word families when really what they mean is mothers and kids. If you read the literature and you look at things around kids and start thinking about, oh, where they use this word family-centered practice, are they really working with the entire family, or are they just working with mom? And you begin to see how highly gendered our services are, our policies, but the policies are obscured because they're usually gender neutral. So it's very important for us to really make that visible and really identify this and really look and work with this, because it's very hard to address this issue without that perspective. And I really want to kind of just touch on briefly, and this will probably be all I can do in the next 3 minutes, and I'll take questions from the sites, the remote sites, and then from here. Is that there have been very critical influences over the years. And again, it's a great chance to reflect on 25 years of work. And but Sue Schechter, Jeff Edelson, Jill Davies, who I mentioned, 2 of them before. Jeff Edelson has done a lot of work on originally on perpetrators and programs and parenting and kids, and he's been very influential in the U.S. and around the world around really clarifying the impact of domestic violence perpetrators have on children. The Duluth model, which often these days has gotten a very negative rap, I think, and somewhat unfairly, that Ellen Pence, the Duluth model, has been very influential, and one of the things I want to say about it is they've got a very radical approach to working with perpetrators. They approach them from a liberation education perspective, and one of their frameworks is that that perpetrators need to be held accountable, and they need to be able to find their own truth about their own behavior. There's a recognition that there's a limit to social control, short of locking every perpetrator up, and even then they continue to be influential, some of them. That if you're going to engage them, you have to be ready to work with them to find their own reality, their own truth about their behavior, and to know how to work with their contradictions and their own values to kind of get them to where they're committed to nonviolence. And there's a real parallel for our work with systems, because we approach child protection in a similar way, which is we want to work with child protection, child safety, other sectors to help them find what makes sense for them in their practice. Because it can't just be me telling child safety how they're supposed to practice. Child safety's got to internalize, this is the best way to practice consistent with our values and our mission and our role. So they've been very influential. Lundy, Bancroft, Batter as Parent. I encourage people to look at that. Evan Stark's book on coercive control and his research on child welfare and battered mothers has been very important, and coercive control is a very powerful framework to really look at this issue and bring it together. Moving a little more sort of east and maybe in this direction in general. If people aren't familiar with Radford and Hester, Mothering Through Domestic Violence, it's a great book that really lays out the issues for women when they're in the family court system, the criminal court system, and the child safety system, and really point out that particularly in the face of the child safety system, the child protections, the family law system, family law wants them to play nice with their partners. Child safety basically wants them to say, run away as quickly as they can, don't have contact with him. And those two systems really put very different pressures on victims. And you can see they're practically unmeldable. Kathy Humphries in her work on child protection, so bringing it to the Australian context, has been an influence in really speaking and being one of the leading voices around internationally around sort of how do we bring together good child protection practice with domestic violence. And I've mentioned George Holden before. So I really wanted to name some of the influences, some of the authors, really be true to the spirit of this is a research seminar. And this data, I don't really, sort of, maybe this is what people were really waiting for, sort of, data that, I'm not going to spend some time on this, but this is really data that drove, I did a national and international study on batters' perception of their kids' exposure to their violence, US and Canada, 1,000 people. There are men in batters intervention programs. And one of the things that came out of it was that batterers were very aware about the impact not only their physical violence was having, but their emotional abuse. It really set the foundation for, you not only can talk to them about these dramatic things, but you can talk to them about the things that we consider less severe, the emotional abuse oftentimes, at least from a systems perspective, and that they're often worried about their kids' future. One of the interesting pieces of data, and I don't think it's here, is that 16% of those guys admit to being physically violent with a partner when they were pregnant. And it really, to that piece of information, speaks to the idea, if you ask the question, you may actually get the answer. That's the bell. I'm gonna cheat for just 2 more minutes and then take questions. But that it really speaks to this idea that if you ask men questions about their behavior, some of them will answer honestly. And it's really on us to ask, to figure out who should we ask, how do we engage, how do we think about these things. The outcome data, we have great engagement from systems who use the model. We have real transfer of knowledge in terms of supervisors, workers, domestic violence advocates. And the piece I really want to highlight is really recent data out of Florida, where we're working with co-located domestic violence advocates and child safety, which means we're training both of them in the model with support from the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Florida DCF, the local offices there. And what they're finding is that as the model rolled out, that prior to the model rolling out, that 20% of their removals of kids were for domestic violence reasons. Over the course of the year, that number got cut in half. That meant more kids staying in homes with victims, with family, less cost to the state, to be honest, because removal is very costly. And that what we saw in that same period was an increase, that red bar, is an increase in identification of domestic violence, which is what you would want to see if there was better practice. And those small little teeny-weeny little lines there is our belief in the data that says there wasn't an increase in repeat maltreatments. This is correlative data. It's over a period of a year. It's based on reports that are coming to the department. There's lots of limitations to it, but it's exactly the triangulation of things we're looking for. More kids staying in the home safely, and a better sensitivity picking up on domestic violence. And this data has been repeated in other parts of Florida, and we're seeing it show up in different ways as well in our research. So I'm going to stop here because this portion's done.
Thank you.
And really ask the remote sites if they've got questions for me. This has been speedy and fast, so I'm hoping there are questions that will allow me to expand on it. So.
Thanks. I saw a slide that you flashed up where you talked about differential response, and I took that to understand that in some states they have a differential response model that you work with and some they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to your experience of differential response and the cross-section between child protection and domestic and family violence with that, with and without differential responses?
Yeah, absolutely. What I can say is that the model is applicable, and it's in some ways it's a back to basics model. And so it's really about the fundamentals of understanding what's going on with domestic violence, being as close as possible in alignment with the realities of the adult victims, the child victims, and that travels across systems and different intervention sort of pathways. And so this model actually is not only applicable for child protection, but family law practice as well. Within the child protection setting, it's both useful for investigative pathways and also assessment pathways that are not investigative. So really more collaborative, family-centered practices, it really works for that as well. And the folks who don't know differential response, it's really the idea that one size doesn't fit all, and that you can work in a more collaborative way with families than just allocating and substantiating an allegation and then kind of holding them to that as you move forward. There's challenges in different modalities, but the practice is the same. You really want to go out and you want to seek to build a partnership with the domestic violence survivor and approach them in a way where you want to learn what they've been trying, validate those efforts, and then work with them around their safety and the safety of their kids. And with perpetrators and kind of using differential response as a perspective, you want to go out and work with them. If you're going to work in a collaborative framework, the collaborative framework still has to be based on the identified behaviors that are of concern. So you're not letting him define the issue. And part of the issue when some of these family-centered practices are done poorly, they actually give domestic violence perpetrators power. Because if I go out and meet with the family together and let them identify the issue, and he says, well, I'm really glad you're here, it's her drinking that's a problem, and because she's sitting there with him, we're not meeting with her alone, she says, you know, he's right, it's my drinking that's a problem. So the whole case plan gets developed around the family's understanding of the problem, but because there's a power differential, it's not the family's understanding of the problem, it's the perpetrators. And that's not just about differential response, it's about any place where you're doing family-centered practice, letting the family define the issue, and not doing good domestic violence, child-centered domestic violence practice where you're separating folks out. Also with differential response, what you lose is the finding against the perpetrator, if you're doing it right, which then the victim may be able to carry it to family court and use as a way to protect the kids through custody and access. So there's pros and cons to both approaches, but the model really works to undergird good practice in either setting, and in fact kind of carries across evaluation, custody and access work as well. Other questions? It's a great question. So, other questions about the outcome data? Yeah.
You mentioned that in some circumstances the system's response was slow. Is that reflective of the blame the victim tendency and the fact that some systems do tend to disbelieve women when they do disclose that they're experiencing violence?
When you say, I'm trying to think of where I reference it's slow, was it slow change over time?
Yes.
That took a long time?
Yes.
It's a great question. This is my belief, and I think when you look at the child welfare literature, the question of domestic violence, there's some great articles, and I wish I could remember the citation right now, but the child welfare system, when thinking about the U.S. context, has been dealing with domestic violence for 100 years, in different ways and different kind of formats. And at some point, there was a very clear, guys are bad, they're the source of the problem, we need to support. And that's going back to, I think, the 20s and 30s in the U.S. And that's shifted, and I think what's happened is that the child abuse and neglect system that's more modern really didn't grow up around the issue of domestic violence as the issue. So part of the issue is the system wasn't designed for domestic violence. That's my belief around that. The second part is that it's historically focused on mothers. And a lot of focus on mothers has been good. It's been supportive, it's been providing their needs for them and helping them become better parents. But in this context, where it's really not well developed around working with men in general and the violent men in addition, then I think the kind of failure to protect blame kind of perspective is derived from institutional factors. And I think the change is so slow, not just because of sexism and misogyny that's there, but I think there's these forces that kind of work about how we think about cases. Yeah.
So a bit like Kathy Humphrey's three-planet conceptualization of the different, the way the different sectors grew up and interact with one another.
That's right. That's right. It's very much so that way. And I think, again, if people are looking to kind of pick out one piece and sort of say, where could we do the most good? I think you really need to think about how does our systems conceptualize first men's roles in families? And then how do we think about violent men in families? And then how do we develop policies and practices around that conceptualization. And so one of the basic things I ask people is, if they think about any cases they're dealing with now with families and kids, would you know what the father's stance is on the kid's therapy or the kid's medication? It's a very basic psychosocial assessment question. And it's a really good indicator. Really, yesterday I asked this question, people start going, yeah, I wouldn't know that. And so I'm not even suggesting he's violent or he's abused. I'm not saying he's good, bad, or indifferent. It's just understanding family functioning. And we've made the influence of fathers, to the detriment of fathers and mothers, invisible, and to kids. And so part of it is to start there, because once you bring the father's focus, behavior into focus, and you don't do it as sort of rah-rah, dads are great as a framework, you go, let's understand dad's roles in the family is good and bad, then it creates a platform to do better practice and decision making. So if you're asking me sort of what would facilitate movement the fastest, you didn't quite say that, but I assume that's implied in your question. That's one of the things I would really kind of do. And I think it's also fair to poor men, men of color, marginalized men here, Aboriginal men. It's really about saying, we want to see your role in families. We want to engage families about your role. And we don't assume it's either good or bad. We want to really know what it is. So, other questions about anything I presented? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I keep thinking about Michael Johnson's stuff,
Okay.
and there's a lot of that creeping into protection order approaches by police
Right.
and family courts.
Right.
And so, do you start at a child protection level with, if there's any concern about violence, taking this approach of separating parents and trying to make this kind of assessment, or do you assume that it's the kind of cognitive controlling violence that you're concerned about? Or because I've got real problems with this Michael Johnson kind of creep that I think is happening in Australia,
Right.
and we see a lot of service providers using that
Right.
kind of approach.
The model really is about describing behaviors,
Yeah.
and not even, and we'll make the distinction, not even ascribing motives to it,
Yeah.
but really asking the question we ask, and that really goes back to the first two critical components of the model, which is really the foundation of the perpetrator mapping.
Yeah.
It's about it really kind of is central in the pivoting practice tool. It's really central because we don't think you can do good work around it. The question is, what do we know from all different sources of information we have
About what this guy does.
about the person's pattern of coercive control and actions taken to harm the children? And you have to have both things in there, because we've defined domestic violence really much as an adult to an adult issue, and we really have to work at really connecting in terms of perpetrators' patterns. So when we talk about the definition of perpetrators' patterns, we're talking about what the difference between how we think about pedophiles and domestic violence perpetrators. We would never say with pedophiles, oh, he perped against his bio kids, but now he's living with another family and they're not related to him, so they're not at risk. I don't think we would ever say that. But we regularly sort of say, well, the couple's no longer together, therefore he's not a risk to the kids. We really do a very relationship-based and geographic-based assessment of domestic violence as it relates to kids. And we need to step away from that. So it starts with this idea that the perpetrator's pattern is both his pattern across relationships, it's his pattern. It doesn't live in the relationship, and it's his pattern that involves her and the kids. And so part of when we go back to this double standard, we want to be able to frame that not only when he's calling her names is he abusing her, but he's also involving the kids in his abuse. And it's not, and this is the challenge, I think George Holden covers a lot of ground with this, that the language is children witnessing domestic violence, children exposed to domestic violence, children involved. And what we really want to reframe it as domestic violence perpetrators who choose to, who make choices that impact their kids around their violence. And the impact comes through a lot of different pathways. So when we do that discussion about what do we know about this person's pattern of coercive control and actions taken to harm the kids, we're including all those things. We're including things he might do to undermine her parenting, to use the kids as weapons. We're really trying to reflect the reality of these families. And then once you have that behavior-based framework and that question, you can take dual arrests or cross orders and say, what are both people's patterns? And what I can tell you from experience is working inside child welfare for years and dealing with 100 cases, it's rarely equal, it's rarely mutual, based on the facts we have.
Yeah.
And so it steps away from the typology model. Just tell me about this if you came through with a case that both mom and dad are violent, I'd say, tell me about both their patterns of coercive control and actions they've taken to harm the kids. And over again, using that very fact-based methodology. I'm not telling you, oh, it's always the woman. And this really also helps with same-sex couples. And it really also sorts out the rare cases where she's really the batterer. We found that happening. It gives a fact-based foundation for that conversation, not stereotypes or assumptions or other things like that. It really it gives that. So I'm very comfortable that we field tested this, that really it's a way to have meaningful conversations around the role of both parents, who's creating the real risk for the kids, and we've seen it played out. And I can give examples if it's useful. But does that help in terms of that? Other questions, because this helps me kind of articulate. Last question.
Last question.
Heather's doing that, and Annie's taking her pictures. And all good. Annie saw my hands moving, and she wanted to capture the action shots. I know exactly how she's thinking. One more question about the data, the outcome material, sort of influences.
I have a question. I noticed you talking about embedding DV workers into child protection environment. Do you have any tips for how to make that work successfully?
That's a great question. I think that a framework like this, the Safer Together model, where there's a focus on perpetrators and perpetrator responsibility, is essential, because sometimes when you put DV sector folks and child safety folks closer together, what it actually does is increase frustration and actually create opportunities for conflict and friction. And nobody feels good about that. You actually increased the contact without giving them the tools to actually better communicate and collaborate together. So really, I think that's one of the tips I have, because we really see it as being very successful. The second is provide training in kind of approaches where there increases capacity to deal with perpetrators and partner with victims as part of the child safety work. So it can't just be co-locating an advocate and expecting them to carry all the burden of the change in the child safety system. Child safety needs to take some ownership around the issue as well, and train their staff and bring their supervisors on board as well, because it's the advocate can act as a consultant and a liaison, but they're not the person in charge of the casework. And the people who own the case really need to buy into this approach. And then on the DV sector side, to be honest, that we often see institutional issues where the co-located advocates don't always have the supervision and the guidance from their leadership that they need. So you want buy-in from that agency and from that staff, because they may be supervised by somebody who doesn't really understand child welfare and doesn't support even the goals of the co-location, to be honest. So you have these issues on the DV side where there's a lot of distrust, antipathy, sort of issues directed to child welfare. So you can have a very isolated DV advocate in child safety, and that's kind of, for that person, it's a lousy feeling, because I'm seen poorly by my peers in my agency, and I'm marginalized in the child safety office, and so I feel kind of very alone in the process. And we don't want to create, that doesn't feel like a recipe for both healthy work environment or change or help for victims. So I think that probably is time. So like a little sprint.